While one of the most frustrating characters, Lilia is yet another example of incredible character writing by Refugin. A girl with simple beginnings, destroyed by a dirtbag, growing strong over time, betraying someone's love, only to spend a great deal of her life, and her daughter's life, seeking a redemption that only she believes is necessary. It's a tragic story, and honestly it breaks my heart every time I think about it. The story of the training hall sister, the princess savior, the maid, the mistress, the mother, and yet another one of my most favorite Mushoku Tensei characters of all time. Welcome back to yet another deep dive into the Mushoku Tensei series. Again, this is for anime-only people that want to get a further in-depth look into the characters and the storylines of the Mushoku Tensei series without getting into stuff that is beyond the anime adaptation. So no worries if you are an anime only, we're only be covering stuff that has actually been covered by the anime adaptation, just stuff that is unfortunately been skipped. To give you a further in-depth look into characters and really show the amazing writing that is unfortunately lost in the adaptation. With all that said, let's dive into Lilia Greyrat. Lilia was born in a remote village in the Asura Kingdom. As she grew up, she was the only girl in a water god-style swordplay training hall in the Donati region. She had no surname, as commoners weren't given one in the Asura Kingdom, and the training hall that she was actually in was run by her father. She took up the blade early and learned quickly. Like her parents, she was terrible with words. Not only that, but she didn't have much charm. She conducted herself coolly and quietly. That said, she worked hard, and those around her loved her. Despite her lack of talent in the sword, many students found it endearing how hard she practiced. The students doted on her, like a little sister, and her life was peaceful in the training hall. That'll change when she was around 13 years old. Her body seen changes from puberty. The students stopped showering with her and avoided speaking to her one-on-one. She was a realistic girl and could sense their hot gazes on her. The other problem that arose around this time was that her mother fell ill and was unable to give her husband a son, someone to inherit the training hall. This meant that Lilia would have to marry a student to inherit the hall. The students, however, were all like brothers to her, which is why none stood out as candidates for marriage. The topic on who the master would choose for her partner in marriage was a hot one. Behind the scenes, those interested would be competing with one another. Then, Paul entered the scene. Lilia's father readily welcomed him. He was bright, with an energetic personality, and became popular with everyone in a flash. He was talented and absorbed techniques quickly. This was part and thanks to the fact that he had already learned the sword god style. It took no time at all for Paul to grow so skilled that Lilia's father couldn't compete with him. With his skills and his popularity with the students, it was soon decided that he would be Lilia's partner. Lilia was bewildered by the suddenness. The speed in which things proceeded set her heart aflutter. Paul was unlike all the other people she had seen. He was so free-spirited. He possessed neither rigid thinking where swordplay was concerned, nor firm beliefs on lineage and inheritance. His carefree lifestyle seemed dazzling to Lilia. But Paul was a bit different than the other denizens of the training hall. And it wasn't just his lack of views on swordplay, household duties, or lineage, but his approach to women. Even though the other students welcomed him in, they suddenly wanted to get rid of him. They were fine with somebody appearing out of nowhere and taking the leadership of the hall away from them, but they didn't like someone who treated something that they held so precious as worthless. While Lilia did go around and reprimand them for their bully tactics, that only made it worse. Any other boy dealing with the type of bullying that he was facing from the other students would have left. But Paul, to Lilia, was a bad boy. His mood soured and he acted out. One night, Paul snuck into Lilia's chambers and stole her innocence. She struggled, of course, but there was nothing that she could do. She was left dazed. She couldn't imagine a boy that she spoke to days before so cheerfully would have done this. Even before her mother discovered her in her chambers, Paul was already gone. After that unfortunate event, Lilia gained a distrust for men. She feared gazes and avoided contact. Despite her father needing her to marry somebody to keep the hall going, he was still her father. Knowing that she could not be with a man, he instead used his connections to recommend her to the Asuran royal family as a maid and a lady-in-waiting, whose duties were to take up arms to protect the royal family when necessary. Even though she gradually overcame her distrust of men while working as a guardswoman and handling her duties with devotion, eventually she would find her fighting skills outmatched by an assassin who was sent to kill the newborn princess. Her opponent's dagger caught her leg, coated with poison, a type of poison meant to kill even a member of the royal family, a type of toxin that could only be cured by purifying magic. While her wound was promptly treated and healed with magic and the poison neutralized, there was lingering after effects, leaving her unable to run at any real speeds, and her gait was reduced to a clumsy stagger. This meant that her life as a warrior had come to an end, and she was discharged from the palace. This decision made sense to Lilia, as she no longer was able to perform her role, and honestly, given her position in the court, she was lucky to not be executed in secret. Still, she considers that they may have set her free in order to lure out the culprit responsible for plotting the assassination. That all aside, this left her unable to afford basic living, and she needed to get as far away as possible from the capital for her own safety. After taking a few stagecoaches, she arrived in the Fittoa region. She knew being a warrior was off the table, and while being a sword trainer was an option, she felt that being an attendant would be better and more pay. There were some employers that she was avoiding though, such as the Lord of Fittoa and high-ranking nobles. Getting involved with them could be bad, with their circles leading right back to the capital. She already had one brush with death, and that was enough for her. After a month of wandering around Fittoa, she came across a job posting that caught her eye. A low-ranking knight in the Buena village was looking for a housekeeper. The posting specified they were looking for someone experienced in raising children, who could also act as a midwife. The location and job fit the bill, but one main thing caught her eye. The employer, Paul Greyrat. The lazy, no-good son of a noble family that took refuge in her family's training hall. Trained there, showed radiant talent, before one day forcing himself upon her and leaving. The man that was like a hurricane. It had been 7 years since she last seen Paul. Not only did he become a knight since then, but he was married now? Lilia could scarcely believe it. She didn't know the ups and downs that he had been through, but if he was anything like she had remembered, then he wasn't a bad fellow at all. She knew that he would help her if she was in trouble. If he didn't help her, well, she would dredge up some stuff from the past. She had several stories up her sleeve that she could use as bargaining chips if she needed to. Yeah. I always got a kick out of the idea that she doesn't seem to see him as a bad person, despite the fact that when he left the training hall, he deflowered her, forced himself upon her, and disappeared. But it's kind of one of those aspects that doesn't kind of counter a lot of the other experiences that she had with him. She doesn't understand why he did it. Kind of left her confused in a sense. With that, she headed to Buena village. Paul welcomed her in with open arms. Zenith, his wife, was due to have a child soon, and they were both frazzled. Lilia had the know-how from seeing to the birth and the rearing of a princess. Plus, she was a familiar face that one of them can vouch for. So they were happy to have her aboard. It was just an added bonus that the pay was better than she had hoped for. And thus, Lilia became the maid for the Greyrats. Jump forward, soon, Zenith would give birth to Rudeus. The birth was problem-free and went smoothly. But once born, Rudeus didn't cry, and his face was expressionless. This put Lilia in a cold sweat. For a moment, she thought it was a stillborn, but he was warm, had a pulse, and was breathing. Still, he didn't cry. This made her recall the things that she had heard from the other handmaids who taught her. Children who didn't cry at birth tended to have a host of abnormalities. As she thought this, Rudeus turned to her and began blurbing random sounds with an expression slack. Relief washed over Lilia. It seemed things would be okay. Lilia assumed that Rudeus' lack of crying was due to the fact that he was physically frail, but he soon disproved this by learning to crawl quickly, making his way around the house, looking away for a second, and he was gone. However, they would eventually find him somewhere in the house, never venturing outside. He'd look out the windows, but perhaps he was too afraid to leave the house. Not sure when, but Lilia eventually developed an instinctual fear of Rudeus. He was always smiling, whether he was in the kitchen staring at vegetables, looking at the flicker of a candle in its holder, or at unwashed undergarments. He was always burbling under his breath, chuckling as an unsettling grin rose up on his face. It repulsed Lilia, reminding her of a particular cabinet minister who would always grin like that whenever he was staring at her chest. Additionally, whenever she picked up Rudeus, he would flare his nostrils and the corner of his mouth would draw up. Panting, he'd bury his face inside of her bosom and giggle gleefully. It sent chills down Lilia's spine, almost to the point where she wanted to reflectively hurl the boy onto the floor. This all made her wonder if Rudeus was perhaps possessed by something malevolent, or possibly had a curse placed upon him. Not being able to stand by idly, she rushed to the store. She spent a small sum of money on what she needed. Then, when everyone was asleep, and without Paul's permission, Lilia performed a traditional charm of banishment from her homeland. However, the next day, upon picking up Rudeus, it was certain it didn't work. Zenith even said things whenever she was feeding, like, "The boy really goes at it, doesn't he?" Lilia thought that she was completely unperturbed by the whole thing. Even Paul, a man of weak principle and a womanizer, didn't give off the same vibes that Rudeus did. Lilia recalled a story from the palace harem. Back when the Osran prince was still a baby, he crawled around the harem's grounds, night after night. It turned out that he was possessed by a demon. Not knowing this, one attendant picked him up, and he pulled out a knife and stabbed her in the heart. It was a frightful story, and Rudeus was just like that. She had no doubt this is another case of demonic possession. While the boy was calm now, one day the demon would wake up, and he'd kill his family in their sleep. Lilia knew that she was going to be attacked. After all, she was the type to take these superstitions quite seriously. After living in fear for a year or so, Rudeus' ever unpredictable behavior changed. At some point, he spent all of his time in Paul's study looking through books. When Lilia peeked in on him, she found him muttering words that didn't sound like common language. She knew that was far too early for him to be talking, and nobody had taught him how to read. The assumption was that he was just looking at the book, rather than reading it, and just muttering randomly. But it sounded like he was speaking with actual meaningful cadence for some reason, understanding the contents of the book that he was looking at. While Lilia found it strange, she wasn't feeling her usual revulsion towards him. Ever since he hid away in the study, his unsettling oddness was abated for a bit. He'd smile creepily every now and then, but she didn't get the chills anymore. He also stopped burying his face inside of her chest and panting. It made her wonder why she had been so unsettled by him. In recent days, she got a sense of his earnestness and diligence, and she loathed to interfere with it. Zenith had noticed the same thing, so at this point, Lilia figured it was best to just leave the boy be. While leaving an infant alone didn't seem very responsible, intelligence glimmered in Rudeus' eyes, in contrast to the mere months ago when it was crude and dull. Several years later, Zenith announced her pregnancy with another child, later to be named Norn. A month later, Lilia would admit to her own discovery that she was pregnant. The only candidate was Paul. This left the house devastated. A family meeting was called, and Zenith was to decide what was her fate. While Lilia claimed that she would leave the house after assisting Zenith with her birth, Rudeus knew that Paul should take responsibility for his actions. To Rudeus, the fact that Lilia or her child's death in travel was almost assured. The fact that Lilia had done so much for him, bringing him a towel to wipe down his sweat after practice, drawing a bath for him when he was caught in the rain, fetching blankets for him on chilly nights, rearranging the shelves whenever he put things in the wrong place. Then there was the fact that she knew about his holy relic that he kept, something that she told no one else. All this in mind, Rudeus decided that he was going to help Lilia by speaking up, claiming that Lilia was unable to go against Paul's wishes, that Paul had leveraged his power over her to force himself upon her, which honestly I believe is a great payback for what Paul did to Lilia back in the training hall. Rudeus really piled it on with Zenith, putting on a childlike act, claiming that his new little brother or sister would have fun with a sibling, just like he had with Sylphie being the same age. After some thought, Zenith accepted this, accepting Lilia as part of the family going forward. From Lilia's perspective, she knew full well that it was her fault that Paul slept with her, being that she was the one that seduced him. While she had no intentions of sleeping with Paul when she first came to the house, hearing Paul and Zenith moaning night after night made her needs build up. She dealt with her needs by herself at first, but seeing Paul training in the yard stoked a fire inside of her that never died. Watching him reminded her of her first time, when they were young, back in the training hall where they practiced, when Paul snuck in her room at night and forcefully had his way with her. She didn't dislike him, but she certainly didn't love him back. It wasn't exactly the most romantic encounter either. She cried at first. The next person who made advances towards her was a bald, fat minister. It certainly put into perspective how much better things were with Paul. It's kind of one of those sad and tragic elements when you get into the idea of somebody finding one forced encounter better than the other. Paul these days was much manlier, and traces of his boyishness had disappeared, replacing it with a look of a man who refined himself both physically and mentally. At the sight of him, one of the first thoughts in Lilia's mind was that the past 6 years were kind to him. Paul didn't make any moves on her at first, but every now and then he would treat her with a sneaky grope that got her worked up. She was able to resist, but knew she was walking down a thin line. That all changed when Zenith got pregnant. Knowing Paul had an abundance of libido, Lilia got it in her head that it was her chance. Thus, she invited him into her room. Honestly, Lilia thought that her pregnancy was a punishment. Punishment for giving in to her lust and betraying Zenith. But she was forgiven. Rudeus forgave her. He was a clever child that quickly deduced what happened and led the conversation to where it needed to go. It was all unsettling, but Lilia knew that she had to quit while she was ahead. She was weirded out by Rudeus, and she made it a point to avoid him as she could. But even though he was smart enough to probably notice this, he still saved her. Feeling that it probably didn't please him to save her, he still chose her child over his own feelings. She would owe him for that for the rest of her life. He was someone that deserved respect. With that debt in mind, once her child was born, she would see to it that her child served Master Rudeus. And here's where we start to get into what I believe is the most frustrating things about Lilia, in the idea that she's already dedicated the life of her child to serve this boy. After that day, Rudeus noticed that Lilia's attitude towards him softened. She lowered her guard around him and talked to him more, even told her stories of her past together with Paul. Cutting forward several months, Zenith gave birth. It was a rough experience, a breech birth. With Lilia gravid as she was, she called for a midwife from the village, an older woman, but even the midwife said that the situation was hopeless. That's how bad it was. The birth took quite some time, with both Zenith and her child at risk. Lilia put all of her combined knowledge to work, and Rudeus assisted her in continuously casting healing spells. All told, their efforts worked, and the birth was a success. The baby came safely into this world, letting out its first healthy cries. It was a girl, who they would name Norn. Their relief was short-lived, however, as Lilia went into labor as well. Everybody was already exhausted. Their guard was down. The words, premature birth fluttered into Rudeus's mind. This time, however, the midwife was able to play her part. While she might not have good experience with breech births, premature births was something she claimed to have experience with. Rudeus did exactly as the midwife instructed, kicking Paul in the butt to snap him out of his daze, to have him bring Lilia into his room. Rudeus then used his magic to prepare new bathwater for the soon-to-be newborn, gathering up all the clean clothes and towels they had. The moment the baby was born, Lilia boldly cried out Paul's name. He was at her side, dripping with sweat, clutching her hand. The baby was smaller than Zenith's, but let out the same healthy cries all the same. This one was a girl too. 2 daughters, 2 little sisters for Rudeus. Before long, with these 2 new children, Paul and Zenith were having shared nervous breakdowns. The only one keeping her cool was Lilia. She tended skillfully to the 2 new girls, knowing full well that Paul and Zenith had it easy with Rudeus. Soon after this, Rudeus would be sent off to tutor Lilia Greyrat in Roa. But with Rudeus gone, life continued. Through Paul's eyes, we get a sense that Lilia realized that Aisha was gifted. She decided to nurture her talents through constant lessons and lectures. While Paul argued that Aisha would be happier if she had a more carefree childhood, Lilia pushed back so ferociously that he had to back down. Aisha was really growing up fast, began walking at an early age, and absorbed everything taught to her like a sponge. Lilia was a good teacher, so it was probably part of it, but Aisha was making so much progress that Paul was worried that something might be wrong with Norn. When Paul brought this up with Lilia, she said that Aisha was nothing special compared to Rudeus, and Norn was a perfectly normal child. While he had no problem with Norn being normal, he felt bad knowing that she'd grow up with 2 brilliant siblings. While currently Lilia was part of the family, married to Paul, that didn't translate to 2 wives, double the fun. Zenith and Lilia had some sort of secret discussion, and worked out some sort of agreement. As a general rule, Paul would be expected to keep his hands off Lilia. The one exception would be that Zenith got pregnant a 3rd time. But in that case, Paul would have to get her approval beforehand. Zenith was a bit conflicted about the whole agreement, but she mostly came to terms with it. Cut forward, we come to the Fittoa region displacement incident. Lilia, thankfully at the time, was touching Aisha, and they were transported together. The teleportation brought them to the Sharon royal palace. Lilia was quickly detained, suspected of being a spy from a foreign power. When she was being interrogated, she invoked Paul and Roxy's name, which kept her out of prison, but that didn't dispel his suspicions completely. Instead, she was confined in the palace. When info on the displacement incident eventually reached Sharon Kingdom, it seemed as if she would be released. But unfortunately, Pak Sharon, one of the princes, manipulated the flow of information, which meant that Lilia and Aisha would be forced to remain there. As Rudeus arrived in the central continent, he had a visit with the man god, who then informed him that Aisha and Lilia were in Sharon. The man god warned Rudeus not to reveal his true identity. Instead, he took on the alias as Kennelmaster. After saving Aisha, Rudeus noticed quickly how polite Aisha was. He assumed probably because of her rigorous training under Lilia. After Aisha explained to Rudeus that they had been confined in the palace for 2.5 years, he wondered if Lilia just explained the situation incorrectly, or if there was other factors at play. He later discovered what this other factor was. It was Pax Sharon. Pax was using Lilia as bait to trap Roxy, which yes, Rudeus ends up becoming the replacement bait, knowing full well that Rudeus was her pupil. As Rudeus was captured, Lilia pleaded to Pax to free him, but Pax wasn't having any of it, instead slapping her and having her locked up. Cutting forward, Zenobia eventually meets Rudeus, forces his brothers to turn against Pax, and everybody was freed, including Lilia, who was still suspected of being a spy, which was technically true because, to curry favor with Pax, Lilia was apparently gathering information from behind the scenes. Still, in order to silence those claims that she was still a spy, she would be escorted all the way to Paul, not to the Ashra Kingdom, but to Paul. This made sense because there was nowhere for her to go in the Ashra Kingdom. Paul currently had stronger ties in the holy country of Milis, so it was better that she would stay there. There was fears that she would be killed to keep her from talking, but Ginger, Zenobia's attendant, volunteered to go with her as protection. This was a command from Zenobia himself, claiming to protect his master's family. On top of that, many soldiers that Reserved had saved their families agreed to go as well, putting Rudeus' mind at ease. Before Rudeus parted ways with Lilia and Aisha, Rudeus sat down to chat with Lilia. Lilia expressed her gratitude for saving her for a 2nd time, but Rudeus didn't feel that he did anything. Instead, directed her gratitude towards Edis and Reserved. His constant rejection of her gratitude eventually led to her conceding. After a long silence, Lilia would ask Rudeus if Aisha had said anything offensive to him. While he claimed that she was an exceptional kid at her age, Lilia didn't feel that her daughter was as great as Rudeus was. Even after all that she had taught her, Aisha didn't realize how amazing Rudeus was. Which, yes, Rudeus didn't really find it good to be calling your daughter stupid. Technically, Rudeus in his own mind realizes that he has his past life experience to really give him that advantage. Still, yes, Rudeus had considered the fact that how smart Aisha was. There was a chance that she was an isekai too. He went so far as to ask her about things like cell phones and TVs. But with every single one of them, Aisha just stared at him blankly. Turns out, Aisha was just an ordinary genius. When Lilia pressed on Rudeus about what he thought of Aisha, he admitted that she was exceptional. And yes, when pressed, she was cute. But no, Lilia was asking Rudeus what he felt about Aisha and her development, how she would eventually grow just like her mother did. But Rudeus obviously pushed back on this. He had no interest in his sister's body. The point that Lilia was pressing to was the desire for him to take Aisha with him. Lilia had been drilling into Aisha's head every single day that one day she would serve Rudeus. She taught her every single thing that she knew. While Aisha was still young, in a few years she would have a body that all the boys would love. Again, leading to Rudeus to emphasize that he wasn't interested in his sister's body. Even still, Lilia knew that Rudeus was a womanizer. But unlike his previous life, Rudeus knew that in this world, he wasn't into the concept of incest, which is why he was uncomfortable with the idea that Lilia was presenting Aisha to him like she was some sort of gourmet meal for consumption. In the end, Rudeus pressed on Lilia that Aisha was too young and needed her parents. While Lilia did accept this, knowing that Aisha was still too immature, her face indicated her disappointment. The problem was that Lilia was teaching her weird things, like about him being a pervert. While Lilia claimed that she only taught her daughter how wonderful he was, he knew that was probably what was causing her to be rebellious. Then Lilia remembered she had something in her possession that she held on to since the displacement incident. She presented Rudeus with a small box, with a pair of pantsu inside, and a pendant. She knew how precious these things were to Rudeus. He asked Lilia if the thought of somebody carrying around underwear made them a pervert, which immediately bugged Lilia. She stood up from her chair, assuming that Aisha had said something, which she did. But Rudeus had her return to her seat. She assumed that somebody in the castle had put some strange thoughts into her head. All that said, Lilia knew that carrying underwear wasn't enough to call somebody a pervert. She had honestly seen much worse things in the Aisha royal palace. That all said, wrapping up the conversation, Rudeus gave Lilia a bunch of money in order to cover their trip to Milis. He knew that if they ran short, she could seek out Paul's subordinates at the Adventurers Guild. He also warned Lilia to be wary of the soldiers escorting them to Milis. However, Lilia wasn't worried about that. She was acquainted with them all, having spent so much time in the palace and meeting the guards. In parting, Lilia hugged Rudeus to her chest, his face smothered in them, his breathing going erratic. She knew that he still hadn't changed from when he was younger, causing her to give off a small laugh. Our final little segment, we find Lilia traveling with Aisha to go to Milis to meet with Paul. Lilia was contemplating whether or not she was happy. She was a mistress, and Paul probably loved Zenith more. Zenith was a dear friend to her, but she had feelings of guilt and remorse. They accepted her as family, but her anxieties and insecurity persisted. Rudeus supported her in this dark time and saved their lives when she was pregnant. All she could think about was raising her daughter to one day serve him. But what did this say about her and her relationship with her daughter? Even Lilia's father cared more about her happiness than his own haul, which is why he helped her find another path. Was Lilia trampling over Aisha's feelings, her own daughter, using her to buy her peace of mind? This only got worse when she realized how smart Aisha was. This thought process changed with the displacement incident. They were transported into an expensive-looking room and soon found themselves surrounded by guards. Lilia pushed Aisha behind her and took up a candle stand. Due to her time away from training and her injury, she was soon captured. As they dragged them out the door, Lilia could only think of her true feelings: to save her daughter. Please, just spare the girl. Please, just help my daughter. I don't care what happens to me, just my daughter. Lilia wept and screamed pitifully, but those words came unbidden and unconsciously. As they were confined in the castle, Lilia's heart was lighter than before. Spilling out those words in the moment of desperation meant she no longer could doubt her love for her daughter, and she was satisfied that her desire to have her serve Rudeus wasn't purely selfish one. Aisha was free-spirited and independent, perhaps because she took after Paul. She hated being restrained and found her mother suffocating. She could never comprehend why she had to serve Rudeus. And being so clever, Aisha detested working hard towards a goal that she couldn't understand the meaning of. Still, Lilia didn't give up. She taught Aisha everything, knowing that one day she'd understand. As long as Rudeus remained the same person he had been on that day when he protected Lilia, Aisha would understand, or so she thought. Unfortunately, Aisha, at this current moment, is boasting about the Kennelmaster. Yes, the alias that Rudeus created him for himself, meaning that Lilia was wondering if Aisha was now in love with somebody that wasn't technically Rudeus, but it was actually Rudeus. Aisha understood how great Rudeus was, but this was also wrong. This wasn't the way that Lilia wanted her to come to understand Rudeus. As Lilia called out to Aisha, her mischievous smile suddenly shifted to a tremble of surprise at her mother's movement. Lilia had a habit of smacking Aisha on the head when she did something bad. Currently, Aisha was teasing her. But being clever, Aisha knew how to bait Lilia into hitting her and resolving it with a sorry. But this time, Aisha didn't know why her mother was angry. Aisha technically was complimenting Rudeus, the one that mother told her to serve. She wondered if she messed up, or possibly if Kiddomaster wasn't actually her brother after all. Yet, Lilia placed her hand on Aisha's head as she froze. Her hand moved to the back, and she pulled her in close. Lilia then told Aisha that whether she wanted to serve Kiddomaster or Rudeus, any choice was fine with her. Even though Rudeus had refused Aisha, Lilia knew that in a few years they would come to be reunited. When that point came, she told Aisha to give everything she had to serve him. As Lilia said those words, she swore to herself that she would raise Aisha to be a wonderful woman, and that it wouldn't be for Rudeus' sake or for her own. Lilia was aware that her own egotistical feelings were still mixed up in that sentiment, but she truly, from the bottom of her heart, wanted Aisha to grow up to be a remarkable woman. As Aisha admitted to being caught in her jesting, she felt uneasy about the soft sensation on her head. Her lips curled upwards as she stammered her incoherent excuses. It suddenly occurred to Aisha that she might not have ever been embraced like this by her mother before. As soon as she thought that, an incredible wave of happiness swept over her, confused by her tears that refused to stop. Aisha just wrapped her arms around her mother and soaked her shoulder. And that is the story of Lilia. And yes, technically Aisha and Paul and Rudeus. It all kind of interweaves into Lilia's story, but holy crap. I almost got emotional again at the end of that story. Like I said at the very beginning, Lilia's story is a very frustrating one for me. Mainly in the idea that there's so much self-destruction that is in Lilia's story. Having this kind of opening segment where she is just the sister of this hall. Everybody loves her. Then at some point, a dirtbag named Paul comes in and wrecks her. Destroys her life. Makes her unable to be around men. Completely ruins her future. But she's given this other chance. She's sent off to the royal palace to be a maid and a guardswoman. And still, seeing destruction happening in her life as more men are forcing themselves upon her. Eventually being wounded. Returning to Paul once again. But this time, her own desires kind of are warped. She still has this thirst within herself, this desire that's kind of rekindled within herself. Despite the fact that he forced himself upon her before, now she desires him. And it's this kind of sad state that she's in. But this is when everything really does shift for Lilia's character. She gives in to these desires, and she welcomes, beckons, seduces Paul into her room. He was already doing things to her, so this is not like he wasn't doing anything. He's walking by, giving her a grab and everything now and then. He's obviously pushing the limits there. Finally, Lilia can't take it anymore, and she welcomes him in. But this is a big, significant change in this whole story, in the idea that this is the point in which Lilia has betrayed somebody that trusted her so much. It's nothing to do with Paul. It's nothing to do with anybody else. But Zenith. Zenith, who welcomed me in, trusted me. I betrayed her trust. She trusted me with her own son. I carried her own son around in my arms. And I just betrayed her. Betrayed her trust. Inside her own home. As she's pregnant, waiting for her child, I betrayed Zenith. But then Rudeus steps up. And Rudeus shifts the conversation. Now, you get a little bit more perspective from Zenith in the Zenith chapter, which I'll probably make a video on eventually. You do get a sense from Zenith's perspective that she kind of knew that Rudeus was lying here. She knew Paul. She kind of had a sense of what happened there. But that doesn't matter. Rudeus shifts the conversation, and in a sense, in Lilia's eyes, saved her life. Despite the fact that I looked at him with distaste, despite the fact that I avoided him, he saved my child. For that reason, I want to devote this child to him. Now, this is where we get to that really kind of unsettling reality of the world that we're in here. This is a world where there is servants, there is maids, there's people that will devote themselves to somebody, and it's something that of an honor. And yes, that's what Lilia is doing here. I'm going to take my unborn child. Once they're born, I'm going to mold them to serve that boy. And it's kind of that unsettlingness there of the idea that this lady is literally trying to undo what she did to Zenith by using her child. This is my redemption. I'm going to sacrifice my child to feel better about myself, to feel like I have done something to repent for having essentially betrayed Zenith's trust. And to do good to the one that saved my child's life, I'm gonna mold my child, give her no childhood, all for the sake of serving this boy. It's such a warped, it's just a warped story that is so tragic and yet so, it makes sense to the setting they're in. It makes sense to what Lilia has gone through. In the end, it turns into something good. It's just a really messed up road. It's like a really screwed up road that eventually comes to some paving that feels a lot more comfortable. And you're finally able to get off the road and say, look, everything's kind of fine right now. Because yes, as you'll find out through Aisha's perspective, even in this chapter, she's happy. She's happy with the idea that she is good enough for Rudeus now. Like, she's happy that Lilia did all this for her so that she could be worthy to stand by Rudeus. Which is, yes, a story that a lot of these girls kind of go through. That's kind of an unfortunate thing that kind of comes from this boy genius kind of mindset and everybody putting on a pedestal. But take it a step back, that is literally Lilia's story. It's tragedy. It's betrayal. It's seeking redemption. It's sacrificing your own child for your own egotistical desires. But in the end, what sort of makes it all kind of a lot less painful is this final chapter here. And this realization moment where Lilia's like, you know what, no matter who you serve, I just want you to be a wonderful woman. That's all she cares. I don't care who you serve. And what she's essentially saying there, whether it's Kennelmaster or it's Rudeus, Aisha, no matter which one you want to serve, it's fine. What she's essentially saying there is, even though she's not really sure, but she's kind of sure that Aisha understands that Rudeus is Kennelmaster, what she's essentially saying is, whether you choose to serve Rudeus or some other person, that's really what she's saying there. I just want you to be a wonderful woman. It's finally that moment where she's like, you choose, Aisha. She's finally allowing Aisha to choose. She knows that she'll realize how great Rudeus is, even though this was like a bad way for her to find about Rudeus, she thinks. She knows that she'll eventually realize how great he is. But that doesn't matter anymore. Because at some point, during this whole displacement incident, she realized how much she loved her daughter. Something that has never really been in her mind, because her whole mindset around Aisha is train, you gotta get better. Learn etiquette, learn how to clean, learn how to do this. You got to get ready to be able to serve Rudeus. Get ready to serve Rudeus. Never, let's go have fun. Let's go play outside. Let's enjoy your childhood. She thought her child became an object to her. But at some point, she instinctually shouted out, "Save my daughter." She realized she's still my daughter, even though for a while she was wondering if that was just an object. But yeah, super good. I hope you guys enjoyed this run through of Lilia's story. It's going to be quite a pain to edit. It ended up being a longer record than I thought it would be, but hopefully it turns out good for you guys. In the end, it's all just a fun kind of deep dive in the novel series for all you anime onlys to get the better, deeper perspective of these characters. And definitely, as we go forward, we'll see the significance of a lot of this stuff. And either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, make sure that like button down below before you leave. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought of this whole segment. Is Lilia best mom for you guys? Is she best girl of this series for you guys? She's definitely in the S tier for me. I think in my tier list, I put her in the S tier. I can't get enough of her story. It breaks my heart. And every single time I hear about her, she breaks my heart. But yeah, truly do love her. For those new here, every Sunday I'm doing a skip content / deeper dive video for Mushoku Tensei JavaScript Nation, only going up to the point that the anime has adapted. So if you're new here, definitely stick around every single Sunday for that. Hopefully I have enough content to reach the return of Mushoku Tensei in April. We'll see. But either way, we'll see where that goes. But still, there's other content on the channel, news, reviews, content. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. If anything Mushoku Tensei drops, I'm on it. If you like the novel series, every Monday I do Mushoku Mondays. Additionally, if you like this content and you want to support this channel more, I have a Patreon link, tips link, super thanks, membership button down below. I greatly appreciate everybody that does. But until the next Mushoku Sunday, y'all take care.